Well, it looks like I completely forgot to press record. That's fine. I think the fact that we know each other is making this whole situation somehow more unprofessional than it would be otherwise, but that's fine. So I'm gonna start out by reading Mark's bio, and then Mark can go ahead and begin his presentation, and then we'll go ahead with Joseph after that. So Mark has been studying the sacramental drug culture relationship for 8 years, having presented his research in Tallinn, Harvard, Breaking Convention, and Prague. His interests span practical and feminist theology, philosophy, critical theory, medical anthropology, and literature. He looks at the relationship between measurable exteriorities, immeasurable interiorities, ritual and value generation, focusing at the moment on syncretic comparativism and natural and feminist theology. He's especially interested in the ways in which ritual, rave, and medical cultures potentiate the psychedelic state, and in the philosophy of cognitive liberty. Having studied theology at Oxford, Mark is also published poet with the first published collection, A Dance of Death, which came out in Halloween this year. He's currently pursuing a PhD at Exeter University in comparative drug culture with Professor Christine Hauskeller, Dr. Leo Rosemand, and Dr. Luis Eduardo Luna. And actually, maybe I will just read Joseph's bio as well right away, so we have that done, so you know who we are here with today. So Joseph Crickmore is an aspiring political theorist and philosopher based in the University of Exeter. While his primary research interests lie in post-Hegelian political thought, particularly critical theory, his participation in Professor Christian Hauskeller's Philosophy and Psychedelics module initiated an interest in the application of political philosophy to the novel concerns of psychedelia. Since then, he has been an active participant in Exeter Philosophy and Psychedelics Research Group and contributed to several working groups and co-authored the article Decolonization is a Metaphor Towards a Different Ethic. The Case from Psychedelic from 2022. Further, he has had the opportunity to discuss Dune and psychedelia in various contexts, including Breaking Convention and the University One Amsterdam. He remains an active member of several research groups for psychedelic studies at Exeter University, viewing psychedelia as Dune's fountain of surprises. So welcome, Joseph and Mark. How are you both doing today?
Really well, yeah, thank you. I'm really looking forward to exploring this in depth with such an expert as Joseph.
Great as well. I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for the opportunity. And I'm looking forward to being in dialogue with my estimable colleague, Mark.
Okay.
Awesome.
Awesome. So, Mark, you can kick us off.
Cool. Let me just share my screen because I have a PowerPoint today. Sometimes I'm against PowerPoints and sometimes I'm in favor of them. And I think this time, I think I should be in favor of them. So, yeah, I've decided to title this talk, What's It Like to Be a Messiah? Ask the Oilhuasca. And to begin, I'd actually like to start with a poem that's not from Dune to get our minds thinking more laterally about the broader issues found within Dune. So this is Rearmament by Robinson Jeffers. These grand and fatal movements towards death, the grandeur of the mass, makes pity a fool. The tearing pity for the atoms of the mass, the persons, makes it seem monstrous to admire the tragic beauty they build. It is beautiful, as a river flowing, or a slowly gathering glacier on a high mountain rock face bound to plough down a forest, or as frost in November, the gold and flaming death dance for leaves, or a girl on the night of her spent maidenhood, bleeding and kissing. I would burn my right hand in a slow fire to change the future. I should do foolishly. The beauty of modern man is not in the persons, but in the disastrous rhythm, the heavy and mobile masses, the dance of the dream-led masses down the dark mountain. So, what is it like to be a Messiah? Is one takeaway question that guides much of the narrative of Dune. And when Thomas Nagel penned his famous essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, he noted that bats sleep upside down, they eat fruit, or they drink cow's blood, they use echolocation, but this is not what it is like to be a bat. This is what a bat does. We can never know what it's like to be a bat, he argues, because a bat inhabits a fundamentally different world with its sensory apparati and qualia to a human world. In the timeless words of William Blake, the emmet's inch and eagle's mile make lame philosophy to smile. Or, the poison of the honeybee is the artist's jealousy. But Herbert challenges these notions through his use of narrative language that is constantly toing and froing between subjective phenomena in the psychoanalytic subtleties of social life, in dialogue and description, the atoms of the mass, and the zoomed out objective sociological, political, and theological forces at play, the disastrous rhythm. So to give an example from the more psychoanalytic side of his writing, this is a beautiful scene where Shani has kind of flirted with Paul to the point where he wants to sing her a song. And the mother, Jessica, is watching over this, and she's still in the kind of feudal trip. She wants him to have a good marriage with a high up lord somewhat, lady somewhere. And so this narrative kind of it's a good expose on the way in which he's very aware of these psychoanalytic and dynamics that are kind of lie underneath human behavior in the inner world. So Jessica felt the verbal music in her breast, pagan and charged with sounds that made her suddenly and intensely aware of herself, feeling her own body and its needs. And Jessica heard the after stillness that hummed in the air with the last note. Why does my son sing a love to that girl child? This is going on in her head. She asks herself. She felt an abrupt fear. She could sense life flowing around her, and she had no grasp on its reins. Why did he choose to sing that song? She wondered. The instincts are true sometimes. Why did he do this? Paul sat silently in the darkness, a single, stark thought dominating his awareness. My mother is my enemy. She does not know it, but she is. She is bringing the jihad. She bore me. She trained me. She is my enemy. So that's one kind of example of the style of writing that you get, this kind of real tortured inner life vibe. And then you also get this completely zoomed out. So page 770, his son is having a spice trip. Movement sent his head spinning over the edge of his spice-burdened consciousness. In that instant, he saw the entire planet, every village, every town, every city, the desert places and the planted places. All of the shapes which smashed against his vision bore intimate relationships to a mixture of elements within themselves and without. He saw the structures of imperial society, reflected in physical structures of planets and communities. Like a gigantic unfolding within him, he saw this revelation for what it must be, a window into the society's invisible parts. Seeing this, Leto realized that every system had such a window, even the system of himself and of his universe. He began peering into windows, a cosmic voyeur. This was what his grandmother and the sisterhood sought. He knew it. His awareness flowed on a new, higher level. He felt the past carried in his cells, in his memories, in the archetypes which haunted his assumptions, in the myths which hemmed him in his languages and their prehistoric detritus. It was all of the shapes out of his human and non-human past, all of the lives which he now commanded, all integrated in him at last, and he felt himself as a thing caught up in a web and a flow of nucleotides. Against the backdrop of infinity, he was a protozoan creature in which birth and death were virtually simultaneous, but he was both infinite and protozoan, a creature of molecular memory. We humans are a form of colony organism, he thought. So this talk's going to have kind of 4 sections. Firstly, I'm going to look at the 3 narrative paradoxes that I see within Dune. Then I'm going to look at 3 social theories that seem to shed light on those paradoxes. And yeah, 2 of these social theories Herbert himself was aware of and was making use of in the narrative and critiquing, actually. I'm going to try and unite them in Brian Eno's notion of scenius. Then I'm going to look at theories of subjective and objective religion in 2 kind of ways. And then we're going to look at the religion of Dune in its own terms and try and decipher some lessons from that. So while many scholars argue that Herbert's is a simple critique of charismatic authority, outlining its dangers and its bypassing of the rational faculty in humankind, I argue that the narrative exposes something a little bit more complex. While there is certainly an ambivalence to charismatic authority, there's also an understanding that it's inevitable and an attempt to empathetically account for what power does to the subject object who wields it, as well as an attempt to lay out quasi-Platonic ideals for leadership. So Paul's constantly trying to calculate how he can avoid this jihad and just create the green planet. And is that, you know, but in every step he takes towards creating this green planet, he's also taking a step towards a bloodshed, gruesome bloodshed. I think in one of the quotes, you know, people making drum skins out of the skins of their enemies in his name. So it's deeply frightening for him that he gains this awareness of the future in such an intricate way. But ultimately he rejects it. He doesn't go from the fool to the, I guess in tarot terms, he doesn't go from the fool to the priest, he goes from the fool to the hermit. So the poles of religious life, the doctrinal elements of social cohesion and control, and the individual life worlds of prayer and spirituality are the inevitable features of the human condition. They're just as inevitable as our worries about solipsism and the blind grandeur of groupthink. So according to the logics of Dune, what psychedelic experience engenders is an awareness of these dynamics through the widening of the gap between stimulus and response. And in providing such an affordance, the ultimate freedom of the superject from and for the subjectively viewed world object and the objective subjects, its people. But anyway, before we get too philosophical, let's look at some paradoxes found in the story. So these paradoxes can help us answer the question, when does the control of a religion over the narrative fall away into a kind of spirited entropy? And what if crude oil was actually ayahuasca? So these narrative paradoxes that I've kind of picked out, why have I picked them out? Well, firstly, I think Herbert did intend for this to be slightly satirical. He intended it for it to be humorful. For example, you know, there's this book within the book called The Collective Sayings of Muad'Dib. Now, what's Muad'Dib? Muad'Dib is a tiny little mouse kangaroo found on the deserts of Dune that he chooses to call himself, and that becomes the name for the Messiah. It's like calling the Messiah mouse or rat. And in the collected sayings, it says, greatness is a transitory experience. It's never consistent. It depends in part upon the myth-making imagination of humankind. The person who experiences greatness must have a feeling for the myth he is in. He must reflect what is projected upon him, and he must have a strong sense of the sardonic. This is what uncouples him from belief in his own pretensions. The sardonic is all that permits him to move within himself. Without this quality, even occasional greatness will destroy a man. The postmodern condition admires this kind of self-aware, mildly mocking guru. If we look at Jim Jones or Osho, to quote really extreme examples, Manson as well, current abusers and blurred liners in the psychedelic space, their appeal lies in a kind of performed self-awareness or a sardonic attitude. So what's funny about Dune? I warn you, these aren't laugh out loud jokes, but more for the chin scratching and ironically inclined. Firstly, there's this human breeding program, which this interstellar priesthood of witches, the sisterhood called the Bene Gesserit, are engaged in because genomics is a taboo. And a lot of this stuff is only possible because there are certain taboos on things which other sci-fis use as plot devices, like genomics or AI. Those are taboo, according to the religions here. So the aim of the breeding program is to create a quasitz hadarach, or a being who can be in multiple places at the same time. The goal is to breed match good specimens from different houses in order to predict the perfect genetic partnership for the birth of a child of this kind. Ironically, though, the perfectly crafted and predicted nature of this breeding program becomes undermined by Jessica's love for Count Leto. And so she uses the powers over her body, because they have such power over their body, they can choose basically which whether it's a boy or a girl, so presumably which sperm and egg become fertilized, and she chooses to conceive of a boy against the wishes of the Bene Gesserit. So what ends up happening is the Messiah pops up a few generations too early and unexpectedly, at least according to the Bene Gesserit, unexpectedly. So this scientific desire to control even something like a religious event is thwarted by unpredictability. You could call it entropy, but there are hints when in the book it says the spirit moves where it moves, that this unpredictability is the divine at work. And if you think about it, what was the original reason for conceiving a boy rather than a girl? Well, it was love for a love between them, rather than a loyalty to the religious strictures. So their plans to make, also, I mean, the reason that the Fremen are receptive in the first place to this Messiah has been implanted into their religious narrative by the Bene Gesserit. So the plan to make a receptive population also backfires. The second kind of paradox or tension is that the spice melange, melange means mix in French, just like crude oil is a mix, is crucial for interstellar trade and travel, and it's monopolized by the vociferously secular guild as a predictive drug for the hypercalculations required for interstellar travel in the absence of thinking machines. Computers are banned. So it's also a central sacrament, and why they banned, well, one of the quotes is, sometime in the distant past, we made machines to think for us or think like us, but that only gave people with power over the machines to have power over us. So there was this jihad against the machines. So as well as being an oil for interstellar travel, in effect, it's a central sacrament for the religion of the Fremen, who are a native people who emerge from a Zen Sunni Catholic tradition, and they've gone over multiple planets, kind of constantly oppressed, and the reverend mothers of their religion worship Shai Hulud, who is whose physical representation is in the sandworm who makes the spice, and their ritual involves the kind of core initiation ritual for the leader involves the sacrifice of an infant sandworm to make a hyperconcentration of the spice called the water of life by drowning the infant. So it's very Catholic, you know, the child of God, kill them, drink their blood, blah blah blah. So yeah, so there's that kind of irony that you have a psychedelic that's also a trade fuel, and then there's this cruel irony of their utopian desire to make the planet a green planet, so they don't have to wear their still suits anymore, which literally recycle the water from their body, so they don't have to harvest the water from their, you know, dead loved ones, because it's the water of the tribe and they need it. There's so little water on the planet, or accessible water. So this utopian dream to make a green planet runs practically antithetically to the existence of spice, because the worms are allergic to water. So yeah, so the proportion of the world that's green is inversely proportional to the spice production capabilities of this world. So it's a theological, psychological, and political question. Does a suffering-free world need a visionary drug? It would also lead to massive interstellar travel ceasing and economic and communicative collapse between the different worlds of the Imperium. But But perhaps more deeply is that point, I think Bruce Parry made it a few breaking conventions ago, that maybe psychedelics are a route towards the creation of a better society. But when that society is in place, do they need it anymore? Yeah, the Fremen on different planets have used different drugs. That's also attested, I think, on page 300, that they use different drugs and different iterations of their culture. So let's turn now to social theory. So yeah, firstly, I'm going to look at Max Weber, then Ibn Khaldun's Asabiya, which also, so Arabic term for social cohesion, and the notion of the senius. But first, yeah, so charisma arises, according to Weber, during moments of cultural stress, psychic, physical, economic, ethical, religious, or political. Individuals with a religious charisma gain it not by being holders of a particular inherited office or official status, but, he says, by gifts of the body or spirit which are believed to be supernatural. He contends that this comes from factors as varied as constitutional epilepsy, or in shamanic ecstasy, or even in acute poisoning. And he quotes the Viking berserkers, who were charismas of the battlefield, who probably used the ephedra stimulant. So charisma's authority, Weber says, is both specifically unstable and constantly being proved, because the codes and the statutes are irrelevant. They're deemed irrelevant, and it derives from a personal revelation of the gifted. These individuals have access to revelation, access to a place which is beyond or anticipating the sociocultural background. But Weber continues, as revelation wanes and the new order is established, this necessarily crystallizes into enduring institutional forms through a process of what he calls routinization, becoming consistently rationalized, methodologically trained, an exact execution of the received order. So this submission under a disciplinary code maintains and stabilizes the shifting nature of the society, which was open to the charismatic impulse in the first place. So he says charisma as a creative power recedes in the face of domination, which hardens into lasting institutions. So, for example, the original narrative and cosmological revelations of the Israelite priesthood, perhaps under the influence of a cocktail of chemicals and spoken down through oral traditions, has been frozen into the scriptures of the Hebrew Bible. The original Last Supper as an event was institutionalized into the sacramental ritual of the Eucharist. It's been argued that this isn't descriptive, but it's an analytic tool to understand, rather than just to describe. It's to try and understand social facts as an antinomic balance between charismatic movements and routinization. There's a lot more to say about charisma, but I don't think I have time, and I do want to get to the interest. I do want to be able to apply it, so we can maybe save that for the discussion later. There's also this notion of asabiya, which is a concept developed in 1377 by, and the only reason I'm mentioning it afterwards is because it makes sense in this argument. This was hundreds of years before Weber, of course, by one of the people considered now to be perhaps the founder of sociology, historiography, and economics, Ibn Khaldun's Al-Muqaddimah, or the Prolegomena. So asabiya, or social cohesion or group solidarity, refers to a sense of unity and collective identity within a group, particularly a tribal, or, he argues, early state societies. And he's using it to try and explain why the Bedouins had so much power over the much more bureaucratically intricate nation states around which they were raiding. He explores how geography, climate, and the environment shape the development of human society. So we see this, the Sardaukar and the Fremen, both incredible warriors, come from these very, very, very harsh planetary environments. So he suggests that nomadic tribes, due to their tougher existence, have a stronger asabiya and are thus better positioned to establish dominance and states, while sedentary urbanized populations, although more advanced in culture and technology, eventually lose their social cohesion because of the bureaucracy and are vulnerable to conquest as a result. So given that this is Weber's notion is to do with a group and an individual within that group, but even Khaldun's notion is to do with the comparative power between groups. So you could call it a kind of group charisma, almost, this asabiya idea. And then finally, we have Brian Eno. Yes, he is indeed the manager of Coldplay, and he did come up with this idea of the scenius, which is the intelligence and intuition of the whole cultural scene, the genius of the scene. In order for Paul Atreides to become the Quasitz Haderach, or the Mahdi, and not be written off either as a madman or just a clever political machinate, it's important that he appears where he does and when he does. The scenius of the Fremen accepts the genius of Paul in a way that, for example, the scenius of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood at the beginning of the book do not. They do not recognize his messiahhood. They missed a trick, and that's partly in a large way because of the context, the scenius. So there's that sense among the Fremen of cultural stress, the religious resources of faith, along with a deep economic need and a longing for a better world. And this is what makes Paul a messiah, not simply his breeding or his way of weaving words and leading or his visionary precog skills. Paul is a messiah because they want him to be, not simply because of what or who he is. So let's turn to religion then. This really interesting idea by Wilfred Cantwell Smith of he basically divided. Hilla, could you send me a message, please, telling me how long I have, just so that I know? Thank you.
Will do.
So he divided like the understanding of religion. This was quite revolutionary at its time. It kind of symbolized the break between theology and religious studies as we now have it, between the cumulative tradition or the lived faith in the transcendent. And the reason that basically interfaith dialogue often breaks down is because if I'm a Christian and I'm talking to a Muslim, I'm talking from my lived faith in the transcendent to his or her cumulative tradition as a contingent historical kind of artifact. So yeah, he says, there is no ideal faith that I ought to have. There is God whom I ought to see and a neighbor whom I ought to love. What Christians and Muslims have in common lies not in the tradition that introduces them to transcendence, not in their faith by which they personally respond, but that to which they respond, the transcendent itself. Traditions evolve, men's faith varies, God endures. So if we look at, say, the origins of the Orange Catholic Bible, which is one of the central texts to the religion of the Imperium, it's quite a funny story about how it came to be. Basically, you get liberals from all the different religious representations, who I find often have more in common than conservatives, and conservatives more in common between traditions than liberals do. But yes, you have like the Zen Sunni, you have the I can't remember their names at the moment, but you have all these different like weird syncretic groups, and liberals gather in this kind of synod to try and create a text that is like an apotheosis or not an apotheosis, a summary, in a bit like Huxley's perennial philosophy, honestly, of the both the metaphysical insights, the ethical insights of all the different religions, to put it into one text. But then what starts off as a kind of interfaith comparative religious text ends up becoming canonized. So this is another example of so here's an example where something that's routinized then becomes charismatic again. It's a kind of accordion motion. But also we have this notion from Harvey Whitehouse, of different modes of religiosity. So here you can kind of see them. You have on the one hand the doctrinal mode, and on the other hand the imagistic mode. of religiosity. So where one is systemic, the other one is emotionally charged and vivid. One is abstract and intellectual and to do with preaching and teaching. The other one is to do with experience itself. And, you know, you could say psychedelic experience falls very neatly into the right column, but of course it doesn't when you look at examples like the Santo Daime, the Native American church, where they have very, very rigid praxes and even teachings that come in tandem with the psychedelic experience, but perhaps more with that kind of maybe the right column fits more easily into the psychonautic or the New Age. But the way in which these interrelate, these two modes, is also interesting. So you can have a kind of, so sometimes they interrelate as a kind of sequence. So first you have one, and that's what you see in charisma, a more experiential and vivid moment that then becomes doctrinal. But sometimes it's also the other way around. You have like doctrines that don't make sense, and then a reformer comes along and creates this new experience out of the old tradition, as we see in various forms of Protestantism. Yeah, so yeah, that's one of the ironies of another irony actually is that when these liberals who have developed this Orange Catholic Bible go back to their home religions, they then get lynched by conservatives. So when the Nava Christians, the Buddhislamists, the Buddhislamics, the Mahayana Christians, the Zen Sunni Catholics all go back, having produced this beautiful text, they then get lynched. So there is a kind of slight dark humor in that. So then we go to these Bene Gesserit. So what is religion in its own, in Dune's own terms? Well, so it uses a lot of terms from this world. So the Mahdi is a Sunni and Shia term for a Messiah. The Lisan al-Ghaib is very similar to the Arabic phrase Lisan al-Ghaib, meaning the tongue of the hidden, or the voice of the hidden. The world that the spice brings you to is the Alam al-Mithal, or the Alam al-Khayal. Sorry if I haven't pronounced that right. The world of similitude, the world of the imagination, the world of the isthmus, which is a narrow strip of land between two seas, so this liminal space. They believe in a ruh spirit, which is identical to the Arabic term for what it is that God breathed into Adam. The blue eyes that you get from this passive and constant ingestion of spice is the eyes of ibad, the eyes of worship in Arabic. But you also have this very interesting Hindu process which the Bene Gesserit are engaged in, called the Prana Bindu method. So prana comes from the Sanskrit life force that permeates all living things, including the human body, and then bindu comes from this a small the one dimension, spot, drop, point, the central point in the mandala, the singularity which originates from the all. The all basically, or the single point. So this Prana Bindu method can be seen really beautifully on page 13. Paul sensed his own tensions, decided to practice one of the mind-body lessons his mother had taught him. 3 quick breaths triggered the responses. He fell into floating awareness, focusing the consciousness. Aortal dilation, avoiding the unfocused mechanisms of consciousness, to be conscious by choice, blood enriched and swift flooding the overload regions. One does not obtain food safety freedom by instinct alone. Animal consciousness does not extend beyond the given moment, nor to the idea that its victims may become extinct. The animal destroys and does not produce. Animal pleasures remain close to sensation levels and avoid the perceptual. The human requires a background grid through which to see his universe. Focused consciousness, by choice, this forms your grid. Bodily integrity follows nerve, blood flow according to the deepest awareness of cell needs. All things, cells, beings are impermanent. Strive for flow permanence within, which is just an incredible description of meditation as seen from a scientifically literate or physiologically literate person engaged in meditation from the inside. But his mum critiques him 200 pages later when he tries to make a battery out of the spice. The spice can also be used to generate electricity, even in a survival scenario. And he does something clumsy. And she says, "You know your mind and Bindu nervation perhaps better than I do, but you've much yet to learn about your body's prana musculature. The body does things of itself sometimes, Paul, and I can teach you about this. You must learn to control every muscular fiber of your body." So if we go back to this, again, this is kind of trying to collapse. You can't necessarily have a lasting emotional memory without the cultivation through discipline and self-control of many years of experience. And then finally, we have this kind of ironic. I'm not sure how much time I have, by the way, but I am coming to an end slowly but surely. This question of what is power. Initially, my first version of this talk, I was going to talk about Ibn Arabi's solution to eternity and how new things can happen in eternity, which Herbert was very inspired by, but I don't have time. I was also going to talk about the superject, but I don't have time for that, so that could maybe wait for the discussion. But I just wanted to talk about this really like powerful scene. So what is discovered in Paul's great revelation when he finally drinks the thing that he's not supposed to drink because he's a man, and he survives and he does it? Well, what's discovered at once is yes, this philosophical insight, but also a very, very specific military and strategic piece of information that gives them an advantage in the war, because as the voice from the outer world, he in a kind of shamanic soul flight, he notices that there's this surprise attack looming that they can thus strategically anticipate. So, but before this, it's kind of established, and I thought this was quite deep when he's having a debate with Duncan Idaho about the fact that he says, the people who can destroy a thing, they control it, so they own it. This is at face value a simple account of Roman and imperial notions of property. So if you just have the right to pluck the apple from the tree, that's usufruct. But if you have the right to chop the tree down to destroy it, then you own it, you control it. But this is more than a kind of economic, military, strategic point. If I were to ask you, what's the most powerful thing to do with the most powerful thing, the answer may come as counterintuitive, but it's part of the reason that the Christian myth to this day proves so powerful. Is the most powerful thing that one can do with power is to actually give up that power, or at least to be prepared to, because the wielding of that power is easy, right? So it's not actually powerful to wield power, ironically. So when Paul breaks from this taboo and becomes the first man to drink the water of life, let's just read what he says. So there is in each of us an ancient force that takes, and an ancient, this is quite controversial for contemporary gender studies students, so I'm not going to necessarily deal with that, although I'm aware of that potential problem in this. There is in each of us an ancient force that takes and an ancient force that gives. A man finds little difficulty facing that place within himself where the taking force dwells, but it's almost impossible for him to see the giving force without changing into something other than a man. But for a woman, the situation is reversed. These things are so ancient within us that they are ground into each separate cell of our bodies. We're shaped by such forces. You can say to yourself, yes, I can see how such a thing may be. But when you look inward and confront the raw force of your own life, unshielded, you see your peril. You see that this could overwhelm you. The greatest peril to the giver is the force that takes, and the greatest peril to the taker is the force that gives. And you, my son, Jessica asked, are you the one who gives or the one who takes? And Paul replies, I'm the fulcrum. I cannot give without taking, and I cannot take without... He broke off, looking to the wall and to his right. You have seen the future. Will you say what you have seen? Not the future, he said. I've seen the now. The space above Arrakis is filled with ships of the guild. The Padisha Emperor himself is there with his favorite truthsayer and 5 legions. The poorest houses are waiting to loot. He then concludes that they must leverage the Fremen-given ability to destroy all the sandworms and all the spice. They must be prepared to destroy the sacrament in an act of political leverage. The keen reader will observe that in Paul's and Jessica's journeys into the ancestry of the Fremen, there have been other planets and they've used other drugs, they've used other sacraments. The spice as a religious sacrament is replaceable, but the spice as oil is monopoly. So to conclude, the lessons I take from it, on the face of all of this, Dune is an intricate display which teaches me that in stressful social circumstances, charismatic authority, whether we like it or not, will stem inevitably from the human need to follow. Religion and the psychedelic experience can be a tool for control and oppression or for freedom and liberation, but nobody controls the narrative. And true power has the ability to relinquish itself. I just wanted to conclude with this beautiful section from when Jessica, she takes this huge dose of the water of life while she's pregnant, and Bene Gesserits have the ability to, obviously, because they can communicate with their own body, they can communicate with children growing within their body. She sensed the daughter mote still touching her in awareness, probed it without a response, and a terrible sense of loneliness crept through Jessica in the realization of what had happened to her. She saw her own life as a pattern that had slowed, and all life around her speeded up so that the dancing interplay became clearer. The sensation of mote awareness faded slightly, its intensity easing as her body relaxed from the threat of the poison. But she still felt that other mote, touching it with a sense of guilt at what she had allowed to happen to it. I did it. My poor, unformed little daughter, I brought you into this universe and exposed your awareness to all its varieties without any defenses. A tiny outflowing of love comfort, like a reflection of what she had poured into it, came from the other mote. So if we, those of you who have read Dune will know, but those of you who don't, in taking this drug, she's going to give birth to a child who is completely conscious, not just conscious like of language, but conscious of all of the female memories of the human species. And that's what she's regretting. And that's why when Paul has sung that song earlier, it's tinged with an extra irony, because this daughter that's born is the one who will create the theocracy that follows. And so with that, whereas Paul just walks into the desert, he said, I can't do this anymore. This is too bloody for me. He just walks into the desert. But his sister creates this horror theocracy, which ends up being just as, if not more brutal than the imperial system that preceded it. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I haven't overrun too much. And that's me.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much, Mark. That was truly a journey in itself, covering so many different terrains, and really appreciating your incredible depth and variety and lens in all these different areas of Dune, and also I think what I really liked, especially in this presentation, is the reflections on the very human experience, like how is Paul feeling all through this, and how is Jessica feeling all through this, and it's just like the individual is still the subject and the center, and I think that's what comes through really beautifully in the films as well, and in their tempo. But so well done. Let's move over to Joseph, and then we'll ask some questions from both of you.
Would you mind ceasing sharing, Mark?
Am I the one in control? I must relinquish.
I might be able to stop you.
You have to relinquish the control.
We all must. Cool. Are you able to see that?
Looks good.
Right. Cool. So Imagine a substance with the combined worldwide value of cocaine and petroleum, and you will have some idea of the power of melange. That was John Michaud writing in 2013 in an article in New Yorker, where he was sort of confusedly lamenting the lack of place in of Dune within the sort of broader cultural space and dialogue. There's only a remark here to say, what little did he know about what was to come. I hope he's happy. So yeah, I'm Joseph Crickmore, as sort of Jana's kind introduction gave, and the only sort of thing I'd add is what a pleasure for me too, as somebody who was very obsessed with these books as a child, and then through my time at Exeter, sort of coming to the Exeter Psychedelic Research Group. Uh, as this renaissance was kicking off, to find what a fortunate way to sort of tie my various interests in sort of political theory and psychedelia together. So today I'm going to try and run through three core topics. I think it's good to contextualize Frank Herbert himself, the author of the Dune series, and his own relationship to both politics and psychedelia. Next, I'll turn briefly to maybe a little bit of context about the world of Dune, but then also of this notion as drugs as a technology of the self, which even if that's particular phrasing isn't very familiar, I think the sort of narrative of it when I explain it will be. And then finally turning to what I think is one of the most prescient messages of Herbert's writing, which is the interplay between charismatic authority and systemic power relations. So, firstly, on Frank Herbert. He's a writer through the 20th century. He was really writing during the age where sci-fi as a media was burgeoning. He was his biography written by his sons quite fascinating for how much of his life was spent paycheck to paycheck or sort of curmudgeonly swearing he'd pay off these debts someday and he'd finally find his success. So he was also doing work as a journalist, especially in his early career, and interestingly, as a political aide to Senator Guy Cordon, a Republican. Uh, Herbert himself was a card-carrying Republican all through his life, but as a bit of a pseudo-Renaissance man, you might want to say, he had many like interests throughout, or personal intellectual interests throughout his life with his wife as well, such as environmentalism, a sympathy for Eastern traditions such as Zen Buddhism, and finally an interest in mind-altering chemicals. In terms of the key political developments that he goes through his life, well, as I say, he was a card-carrying Republican, and he was working within the Republican apparatus. And at first, he characterized his main political interest as a journalist as being concerned with what it is about the myth fabric of society that creates a Mussolini or a Stalin. But then he's working as an aide to Guy Cordon through both the end of and the sort of wake, the internal antagonisms and what happens of McCarthyism. And interestingly, Herbert himself was a distant cousin of uh, Joseph McCarthy himself, who he knew and would call Cousin Joe. And this transformed Herbert's political thinking quite radically. He said himself in Dune Genesis that his questions turned from these questions of what it is that makes Mussolini or Stalin to what it is that makes a Nixon. And then the other sort of key personal development I think it's worth bringing out is that through his work as a political aide and a speechwriter for Guy Cordon, he also spent time with the Quiloit tribe in Washington. Daniel Immerwahr writes of this that he was working within an imperial apparatus during the age of decolonization, which seems to have given Herbert, and as his son Brian Herbert also reflects on, seems to have given Herbert quite a an internal discourse and a consistent conflict in terms of the role of power and pervasive power relations, but also of the pervasiveness of colonial power even beyond the sort of overt colonial imperial apparatus that we typically associate there with. Um, so, in terms of these themes, then what are the key themes that he carries over into his writing? Well, he has a intense concern with leadership, as has been flagged quite well, like very well by Mark through his talk. He has a fascination with the relationship between religion, politics, and power. I shouldn't pause to say Mark did this well, did this well, did this well, but he did that well as well. He's also very concerned with ecology, and he's one of the first writers to deploy systems thinking, which is a theoretical framework or political theoretical framework, into his writing. He's concerned very acutely with human evolution and potentiality and the ways we might achieve that, and related thereto, both the effects and pervasive role mind-altering chemicals have always played throughout human society. Um, and then in terms of psychedelics, it has always felt when talking about Dune to try and tie Herbert overtly in some way to to psychedelia. But one of the consistent challenges with this has been that obviously he's writing and operating in an era of prohibition. We don't lack for sources and texts and even interviews where Herbert's speaking, but overt references and commitments to psychedelia are quite rare in his work. There's also an additional context I can give that he had a son who, in Frank's eyes, fell to the sort of summer of love and hippie style thinking, or fell off the wagon, you might say. And so he himself had a sort of tense relationship with the way psychedelic drugs were operating at the time of his writing, but also sympathy there too, and definitely an overt critique of the sort of prohibitionary era that was acting upon them. But if we're trying to build a picture of what Herbert's relationship himself or what his own relationship to psychedelics is, we have a few accounts of his personal engagement. We have Paul Stamets, who you should all be familiar with, the writer of Mycelium Running, who recalls an account where he visited Herbert late in his life and found that Herbert had found a unique way of cultivating psychedelic mushrooms in his own space. What I had always thought and what I'd always said when I was sort of presenting on Herbert and psychedelics is that when we would apply it to Dune, we would have to go for informed speculation. Otherwise, we would read into that Stamets quote, and that would be it. But upon examining Dreamer of Dune a bit more, which is Brian Herbert, his son's sort of biography of his father, not only is Brian overtly tying Herbert's own relationship to psychedelics to Herbert's writings, but he actually gives us plenty of accounts of Herbert's own use of hallucinogens through his life, including an experience with peyote. So the sort of informed speculation I'd always cast is not necessary. We know that Herbert himself was an active user of psychedelics and had a personal interest therewith. And then in terms of how this fed into his writing then and his literary engagement, one of the interesting examples would be this book, The Santa Roga Barrier, which is written after the first Dune book, but before any of the others, if I remember correctly. In this, and I do think it's worth pausing and looking at some of the psychedelic imagery that's sort of used on the covers here. I just think it's quite beautiful imagery. But in this book, Herbert is painting the picture of a community who disseminate its norms and its practices and very much maintains itself through the forced dissemination of a psychedelic substance called jaspers. I believe it's some sort of cheese actually, which they nickname consciousness fuel. And so within that, you have key characters through the book. If they're breaking with the traditions and practices of this community, uh, dissemination of these drugs and consumption there too ties people back together within the unit. So you can see very clear thematic messages to Huxley's Brave New World. And then otherwise, we come over to Dune, which again, there's no need for informed speculation anymore. Uh, it had always been the case, I thought, that people like Alejandro Jodorowsky, who had a failed attempt to make an adaptation of the Dune films, uh, saw so much psychedelic imagery and so much psychedelic potentiality in the work that they wanted to imitate it within the films themselves. You have that quote here that my movie would give people who took LSD at the time, or sort of imitate the experience of taking LSD at the time. But again, you have Brian Herbert writing in Dreamer of Dune that his own experience, Herbert's own experiences with these drugs, particularly his experience with peyote, um, contributed so much to the imagery that Herbert was able to draw from in accounting for these experiences, in accounting for the experiences of people in Dune, but also then a sort of sympathy and interesting a sympathy and interest, sorry, a sympathy and interest in them in the future. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat, but I would say that yes, there is a brilliant documentary about Jodorowsky's attempt called Jodorowsky's Dune, which I'd thoroughly recommend that anyone watch. I use some of the imagery in that in the talk to come. But then otherwise, so in Dune, where are the psychedelics? They're very clearly in the spice itself. It's a fungal excretion of the sandworms that are roaming through the planet, and many of the sort of experiences users will have through the space are clearly hallucinogenic, but as I'll come to, have many sort of veridical properties shared with the typical psychedelic experience. So that's Herbert. And writing in Dune Genesis here, he's talking of fugal interplays and this pattern of the fugue and a very sort of esoteric and I would argue like narratively psychedelic uh, theme that is running throughout all of his books, while also sort of prefiguring where much of what his own political writing is going to become through the text. So turning now to drugs, well, Dune, drugs, and the sort of notion of technologies of the self. I've shaved out much of the imagery of, or sorry, much of the sort of commentary of Dune as a world. Previously, been under the impression that not too many people will have engaged with it, but we now have the benefit of several immense films to sort of introduce the world. For those who aren't too familiar, we're dealing with an interstellar Anthropocene, a world where humanity has sort of disseminated itself across the stars. We're only able to access and travel interplanetarily through the use of psychedelic substances. Humanity is constrained by a robust imperial or simultaneously imperial and feudal apparatus that exerts rigorous control not only over the sort of political economy of its empire, but also of its subjects themselves. Other contextual features of the world are that it's one very concerned with human augmentation and technology. As many of you will have noticed in the film, there's this notion that comes from the Butlerian Jihad and from old conflicts in humanity's past that thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind, meaning that any form of complex AI has been eradicated within human society, and instead it's humans that need to fulfill the role that we would typically associate with a machine. So again, in the film, the role of the mentats, as you will have noticed, is to be these sort of almost like chat GPT human advisors that are able to make complex calculations and in both like a mathematical and a political or strategic level for their overlords, that sort of thing. And there at the bottom, psychotropic substances, as a result, are deployed as technologies to aid in the development of consciousness. So, what is this notion of drugs as technologies of the self? We have this substance, the spice melange, which clearly has rich psychedelic properties. It incurs time dilation within its experiences, ego dissolution, and oceanic boundlessness, to name a few. Paul himself, when he experiences spice for the first time, I think the description thereof reads very much like any sort of trip report that you would come into. So, and in a universe that I've just painted, there's clearly potential, one might argue, for the application of Foucault's technologies of the self. Now, this notion is one that Foucault advances as a way to break with power relations. It is a way to, when you are enmeshed in a society that robustly exerts power through the use of overt force, but also educational institutes and cultural institutes. Foucault is reaching towards the end of his career for means by which the individual might escape these like rationalistic logics and the exertion of power again, and find ways to sort of engage in a mode of authentic self-creation. So as you can see here, technologies of the self are ways to sort of engage in operations that can achieve certain states of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality, all with a view to escaping pervasive and systemic logics. I'm not the first to draw a link between drugs and technologies of the self, and I believe that this thematic narrative, the idea that the use of psychedelic drugs is not only a way to, well, achieve many things, but overtly to cultivate the self and to develop the self and whatever other narrative you might want to use, is one of the key talking points and narratives that we use throughout the psychedelic renaissance. We might not use this particular term, but this notion that the dissemination of psychedelics in some way enhances the self are common narrative tropes that we deploy when discussing the renaissance. And this is an image from Jodorowsky's Dune, which I think is capturing the same sort of vibe, this notion of us seeing deeply, seeing beyond, and managing to transform and cultivate the self. So this might all sound very promising, right? But the environment, as I've already alluded to, the environment in Dune is one where these drugs are rigorously shackled, almost. You might argue, if you're sympathetic to that narrative frame, that these drugs are constrained and shackled by the sort of apparatus they're embedded within. So there is profuse dissemination of various substances, including spice, but always their use is constrained through what are called instrumentalized logics of use, or uses for a purpose, such as, again, the Spacing Guild's use of spice to warp space-time, the Mentats consume Sappho to sort of hone their cognition, the Bene Gesserit engagement with spice as a way of cultivating prescience and deeper knowledge, and a dissemination of spice among the broader populace, especially the wealthy populaces in the empire, for a sort of pleasurable function, but always carefully and controlled and monopolized, in fact, by the imperial apparatus. So a robust political economy has sort of come to define the situation of the spice within Dune. And I just wanted to pause here to sort of bring up the peyote cactus, just as, because I'm not contextualizing the entire world, there's a very clear analogy here between, if we're just at this moment, between the contemporary situation of the peyote cactus, which is being exploited to the point of near extinction by various sort of, well, various logics of use and communities, and risks being sundered from the historic and traditional Amerindian uses that there already always has been, much like the Fremen, whose access to the spice itself is being exploited and extracted by the Empire. So from this situation, we arrive at this quote: "He who controls the spice controls the universe." We've profaned this substance that's rich with potentiality and has a rich spiritual tradition, as Mark is highlighting, by trapping it within colonial and political logics of power. So we turn to what I'd argue would be Herbert's central theme throughout Dune. And this is his wife, Irulan, writing on, sorry, not Herbert's, this is Paul's wife, Irulan, writing on Paul during his sort of apogee, his, what is meant to be his height of success, that he is the servant of power and terror. Violence, but and critically deification, is a prison enclosing him. He will lose everything and it will tear him apart. Dune, in many ways, serves as a critique of the hero's journey, and in fact, for more random biographical facts, Herbert himself was driven most acutely to expand on the Dune universe at first by an almost curmudgeonly and grumpy observation that many of his readers didn't get the point, I think was the quote. And as you can see here are just two quotes from Herbert, again towards the end of his life. He sees Paul's journey to, ascend to the top of the imperial apparatus and wants to code it at first with an air of sympathy, right? The Atreides have been this noble Homeric Greek house that have been unjustly betrayed and overturned by the obviously negatively coded and barbaric Harkonnen. Paul's also fighting a decolonial mission to liberate the Fremen, and he's armed with this mystical substance that gives him deep spiritual wisdom. There are all the markers here of a very typical hero's journey. So if the books ended at the end of book one, that would be wonderful, right? But Herbert kept writing. He believes that overinvestment, or what I think would be the key thing to focus on, enthusiasm, uh, isn't, and especially the enthusiasm for particular figures, is an immensely dangerous game to play. Beneath the hero's facade, you will find a human being who makes mistakes. But as Mark highlighted, and as I'll circle back to, it isn't the individual and it isn't the sort of charismatic figure that is most in Herbert's scope. It's systems themselves that he sees as dangerous. Systemic is a deadly word, and while systems will always incur and entrench themselves as a result of human action, it's the way they play back against figures, be they charismatic leaders or individuals ourselves, that Herbert wants to really highlight as the objects of critique. So one way to sort of frame this systems critique is to just give reference to one of the things that Herbert thinks is most important within his work, which is ecology. Those of you who've seen the films will be very familiar with Liet Kynes, or at least the first one. She, in the films, was a planetologist who served this dual role of both being an indigenous Fremen and embedded in the traditions of the populace within the world, but also an imperial planetologist, somebody who has been ascribed by the colonial apparatus to try and help exercise power over both the resources of the world, but also the world itself. And Kynes, throughout her career, then let's say for the films, is fascinated by this notion. There's more in the book, sorry, but is fascinated by this notion of being able to terraform and transform the planet, as Mark highlights, or like as Mark noted. And to skip to the end, in within the narrative, Kynes is serving as a sort of Odyssean figure within the dialectic of enlightenment. She's trapped between self-preservation and self-annihilation, and these dual roles of the attempt to exert control, but also to absorb herself within the more authentic, what we might call authentic traditions of the Fremen. And Herbert tries to make this acute in Kynes' death, where he writes, as his planet killed him, it occurred to Kynes that his father and all the other scientists were wrong, that the most persistent principles of the universe were accident and error. Kynes, in the book, is left to wander the desert alone and is killed by the environment that he or she has tried so desperately to exert control over, and sort of in this attempt to exert power over the environment has failed and met annihilation. This thematically has a great link to something like Arne Naess's Deep Ecology, a quote of which can be seen on the screen here. So what falls from this? It's logics of power, logics of control, and rationalisms, let's say, of control that have exerted power over this individual and defined their sort of role within the narrative and have ultimately led to their self-destruction, despite the fact that these are overtly what you'd call good people, I suppose, in many ways. So turning back to what Herbert's central concern, power and charismatic authority. Herbert's interviews and writings are profuse with articulations of being fearful of enthusiasm and of charisma and always being skeptical. He himself, through his political engagements, was aware of the work of sociologist Max Weber, writing in the early 20th century. Weber himself working during the most primarily during the Weimar period of Germany. Weber tried to articulate in within this period a descriptive sociology of the various forms of authority that can manifests throughout society, basically the sources of legitimate authority within historic and contemporary societies. And he identifies three. The first would be traditional authority, which is the authority of the eternal yesterday, the authority of tradition, or like patrimony and inheritance. For the second would be rational legalistic authority, which is authority by legality, by the possession of office, or by appointment via process or law or statute. And finally, Weber identifies charismatic authority, which is authority that is exercised and finds legitimacy through grace, charisma, devotion, confidence, and commitment. So it's very clear in Herbert's writings that he has this in mind as he's articulating sort of into the what do you say, the fugal interplays within Dune. Traditional authority is embedded or quite clearly reflected in the Fremen, to the point where Herbert has a ritualistic duel called the Kadi ritual, imitated in some of the articulations of traditional authority that Weber articulates. Rational legalistic authority is very much the sort of sway of the colonial imperium, which is all about the logics of power, extraction, control, and legal process. And then finally, charismatic authority is very clearly embedded, firstly, in the messianic figure of Paul Atreides. And it's good to pause here, as Mark noted, to just reference that Weber himself is making no normative claim here. He isn't making a claim about the preference or the greatness and the weakness of one over the other. He himself obviously had an emphasis or a sympathy for a rational legalistic form, but in many ways these are just meant to be descriptive evaluations. And Weber himself observed that charismatic authority, while untethered and hard, like uncontrollable, let's say, tends to rise up as is echoed in Mark's talk, in times of stagnation or decline within a political order. It's in that sort of arena that a charismatic leader can rise up. Um, just as one might reflect solemnly that Weber is writing this during the Weimar period in Germany, not knowing exactly where charismatic leadership would take that nation. Um, Herbert's own takeaways from this system are that there is something to be feared, or at least something to be rigorously examined and critiqued and carefully watched about the notion of charismatic authority. And we see that through Paul's journey in the books. Paul ultimately, through his mission, I could go and like talk you through the whole book, but all three books that he features in, but that probably wouldn't be fun. Paul's journey is characterized by being shackled by the sort of colonial logics of power that he's come to take over by rising to the height of the Imperium. He's failed to stop the genocide of many imperial populaces as a result of, again, following these logics of power and these very typical notions of freedom that the Imperium has given him, and fails in many ways to undermine the underlying logics of power that have come to allow the Imperium to exert this control to begin with. As Mark noted, he himself is guilty of monopolizing and even furthering the monopoly of the spice under imperial control, rather than making any attempt to sort of decolonize or disseminate this substance. As a result, towards the sort of end of his life, and as he's finding that his children are acting against him and he's losing control of this apparatus now, his charismatic authority is diminished and systemic logics remain. He is left to wander out into the desert alone in his failure. In And at the bottom here, we just have some writings which sort of reflect on this. Suzanne Ziegler writes that coloniality mixed with drug literature allows the subject to know and possess the entire world, to penetrate the outermost limits because they're at the same time innermost. And we have Higgins remarking on Dune as the tale of colonial conquest of inner space. Paul has served as a immensely self-reflective but ultimately unconscious critic of many of the logics of power that have situated him in his position at the center of the new imperium, and failure within this apparatus and the immense violence that comes in the wake of his ascent. Herbert would write is inevitable, and he comments here again in Dune Genesis that, in many ways he's talking about Paul's attempt here when he says if you want an absolute prediction, you only want today, you reject tomorrow. You are the ultimate conservative, and you're trying to hold back movement in an infinitely changing universe. And this theme, again, turning back to the dialectic of enlightenment, is sort of commented on by Adorno, who says that to basically summarize, just to make sure I end soon, is commenting on that one of the most pervasive exertions of power is that of ideology and of rationality. In this case, he's referring to the ideology that the myth of success that is internalized so robustly by the masses is allows the logics and the systems of power to remain entrenched, and is ultimately one of the most robust exertions of power, entrenching the system and allowing the sort of misplaced sorry masses to remain in their position. So Herbert provides an outside to this, or provides the sort of what his answer to the pervasity of ideology and systemic rationalities would be in his son, Leto Atreides. There are some interesting reflections on this theme of the place of the Messiah that Leto, in pursuing the like sort of the wisdom of the spice, let's say, and in pursuing an answer to his father's failure, or for those of you familiar with the books, also a way to achieve what Herbert calls the golden path, loses his humanity. This is not your typical hero anymore. He's, as these images show, become this horrendous worm. He is a awful tyrant and is overtly violent and abusive to those around him, but he's come to inherit the empire and seize the apparatus of control. Similarly, as he has sort of surrendered to these transformations the spice has given him, he's often speaking in Nietzschean aphorisms more than he is typical collected exchanges, which is where we get Herbert almost overtly speaking to the audience when he's saying things like, adopt a system, accept its beliefs, and you strengthen the resistance to change, referring again to back to his father Paul. But there's also a beauty in Leto's position. He's writing that dreams are messages from the deep, and he's reflecting in his journals that the various psychedelic images he has just interwoven with his waking consciousness, such as thinking of the joys of motherhood, and suddenly the birthing beds are his. And he's very aware that this knowledge and these experiences that the psychedelic spice is giving him are key to his sort of wisdom and his ability to find a path through and to achieve the golden path. So, pausing to reflect on the role of charismatic authority and leadership, Herbert isn't here saying that we need to be anarchists, let's say, and that charismatic figures are in no way serving a useful role. And Leto himself, in many ways, is a sort of tragic messianic figure. But the difference here is we have a conscious critic and a very conscious critic and careful, I don't know, actor within the system who is aware of the ideology and the logics of power that he's come to embed in himself within, versus one who is not. And while Leto's means of achieving the sort of decolonization of the empire is an interesting one, which perhaps we could talk about in the Q&A, it's ultimately through the sort of ironic centralization of all power into himself as a first port of call. It is a successful one, and it's one that is consciously concerned not with providing, and he is consciously concerned with, and his methods are consciously concerned with, never providing robust, defined answers to the path forward and liberation, but to assert the need of openness and of the ability the ability of a leader to take a step back and allow society to move forward in many ways. There's almost, if any of you are familiar with Hegel, for example, a sort of reference or throwback to the owl of Minerva. And it's very well summarized in one of his closing writing, or one of the closing writings of God Emperor of Dune, where a theorist is reflecting on Leto's role after his own death and the value of the wisdom the psychedelic spice has given him. When he remarks that we will not try to predict the discoveries yet to be made within those pages, we say only that they must be made, for we are the fountain of surprises. Here saying that there is, our role is not to find and define the future, but to assert openness, critique, and an unpowered is the most elegant phrase I've got, path forward. So just concluding now, in terms of the lessons that emerge from Dune, Herbert's central enemy is not charismatic authority, but instead it's the enthusiastic exercise of and participation in power relations when bereft of any sort of critique of the underlying logics and ideology at play. He he's very in line with typical decolonial theory when he's arguing against the pursuit of any sort of tangible path of liberation, but instead in pursuit of a tangible unknown in an infinitely changing universe. We also have a clear advocacy for the fierce potentiality of mind-altering chemicals, both for the expansion of consciousness as a technology of the self, but also as a tool for political critique and for human liberation. But where it's clear that while this potential is there, it must be protected and cannot be surrendered to these systemic and political logics. So if we draw it out overtly, one of the central themes would be this pursuit of openness. It would be that it is a dangerous game to attach yourself to the powers of persons and the particular exercises of power, but instead or for example, to trust that surrendering these substances to medicalization as a path for liberation is the way forward, but to always be a conscious critic of these logics and to find a path towards openness. And he himself sort of closes Dune Genesis with these words: caution is indeed indicated, but not the terror that prevents all movement. In the psychedelic space, I would say we should hang loose, and when someone asks whether we're starting a new cult and surrendering to enthusiasm, we should do as Frank Herbert does and run like hell. I overran. There's some references, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Joseph. That was brilliant and beautiful graphics as well. So much substance in both of these presentations, but yeah, exactly. So I thought since we have slightly less time than I anticipated, maybe we're just gonna do a mutual Q&A where hopefully both of you can just branch into deeper directions, and hopefully we can further explore really the parallels of the psychedelic renaissance as we understand it, and I guess the hypothetical dystopian prospects that Dune portrays, as well as the internal dynamics of the individual that is undergoing all these different experiences as while they're being exposed to the spice and the psychoactive effects of them. So now also for the audience, if you want to join us, you are welcome. You can just send me a direct message or send a message in the chat. You can hop in here and ask your question in person. You can also use the Q&A box. So, oh, it looks like we have Christine here. So maybe we'll start with that question from the Q&A box, and then I have some questions as well if there are none more from the audience, but please send us questions. So Um, if you have time, it would be interesting to hear from both of you more about whether this poetic work of fiction from a conservative author has some important aspects for us to consider about societal space and the role of psychedelics today. And that question is from Christine.
Would you like to go first, Mark, or hello, Christine?
I do have something to say in response to that. Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So firstly, to remember that I think this is something that I'm not so historically clued up on, but in terms of the Republican Party was actually the more left-wing party before Nixon, right? And that's when he was a member. So I wouldn't necessarily call him a conservative. He's certainly a bureaucrat. But yeah, I guess, but it's certainly his views of gender and things like that expose a certain conservatism. So there's a really moving section when Paul realizes that one of his best friends has basically stopped being a friend, and I'll just read it in full because it's really beautiful. I think this will like hopefully galvanize how important it is to and expose the ways in which what charismatic authority does laterally between relationships that are kind of intoxicated by that authority. So yeah, I'll just read it. So in that instant, Paul saw how Stilgar had been transformed from the Fremen Naib, a chief, to a creature of the Lisan al-Gaib, a receptacle for awe and obedience. It was a lessening of the man, and Paul felt the ghost wind of the jihad in it. I have seen a friend become a worshipper, he thought. In a rush of loneliness, Paul glanced around the room, noting how proper and on review his guards had become in his presence. He sensed their subtle, prideful competition, each hoping for a notice from Muad'Dib. Muad'Dib, from whom all blessings flow, he thought, and it was the bitterest thought of his life. They sense that I must take the throne, but they cannot know that I do it to prevent the jihad. So, I think that, people we follow in this space, gurus that we follow, need to be firstly understood as like corruptible, changeable humans with their own motives, as Joseph has very eruditely explained, was one of Herbert's main points. But also to notice what it is that charismatic authority does to a group laterally, like within members of that group, can be quite toxic, incredibly toxic. So I think just a kind of awareness of when that charisma emerges from the cultural stress, or when you're following someone and hanging on their every word, what that can do to your relationships around you, to your left and your right, if that makes sense.
I'd maybe add, I think I can do it. Like, there's almost a personal thing for Herbert in this interaction between conservatism and the sort of radical openness he's articulating for. Guy Corden, the senator he was attached to, was a critic of McCarthy through McCarthyism. And what I kind of see in Herbert is almost a feeling of having been party to, or a believer in, the sort of project of perhaps his own party, but broadly of Americana, let's say, which he certainly in his youth was a firm proponent in, and believed that America was the great antidote to Soviet totalitarianism, which was his original concern. And seeing not only his party, but also his, but more robustly, his nation turn to, in that era, something so corrupted, let's say, or something that went so robustly against his own values, I think helps inform some of the feelings of almost like despairing caution he's trying to articulate through. And if there was an analogy, it would be that he'd almost want you to say, imagine yourself in my position now at the start of your psychedelic renaissance. Don't let over enthusiasm and over faith in individuals within your movement, let's say, and certain decisions they make, leave you in the position I was in the wake of McCarthyism, of having been party to something that went so robustly against my values and what I really thought the project we were all going in for was, if you get what I mean. I think there's a sense to which I think the conservatism he had almost adds to the personal appeal he's making there in some ways.
Yeah, awesome, both of you. Wonderful reflection around not hanging to any individuals each word, and kind of seeing that potentially there could be this warning also for the psychedelic space as it is, as it stands. Also, when it comes to the experience, the internal experience of Paul, I mean, especially watching the movies, again, just talking from the perspectives of the movies, I'm not sure how Paul's internal landscape is really reflected upon during the books, but obviously the movies make it seem extremely psychedelic and a very dreamlike, and he's kind of constantly going in and out of this sort of state, having these messianic visions of himself while then trying to return back. And I guess there could be something quite akin to the psychedelic experience also, and its impacts on an individual, where sometimes these experiences can be so mystical and mysterious and quite grandiose that they end up expanding the individual's ego rather than vice versa. And I think that tension is there in Dune as well. So I was wondering if either one of you had thought about this particular internal dynamic, where the ego is challenged to undergo a metamorphosis, but then there's also that pull to, for Paul specifically, to become a kind of messiah, but also simultaneously there's the same pull for the others to believe that he's the messiah, as they are also swamped by the spice. So yeah, would be great to hear your thoughts further on that.
You want to go first, Joseph, this time? Or?
Yeah, sure, sure. So the thing I found most fascinating in this is like the way he juxtaposes it with Leto. I think Paul is, neither of these figures are. I think they're both heroes within Herbert's narrative. I should be quite careful to make clear that he's not disavowing Paul. Like so much of Paul's internal dialogue throughout the first two books is this almost tragic despair at what's happening. You have this sense he once had that he needs to become this messianic figure, which is ultimately, as you're identifying, quite ego-driven. With a real fear, he's had these prescient visions of what will come and believes himself above that almost, and that he can try and exercise his own power over that, ultimately out of, in many ways, immense like residual personal and human attachments. He, in both of these figures, there's also the sacrifice of the human. For Paul, it comes in having to choose basically between the, let's just say, selling out, because I don't want to explain the whole thing, and recovering, or sort of getting his lost wife back, who's been the sort of love of his life throughout his, well, life, uh, and not doing so, and sort of retaining some sense of righteousness and dedication to what might be right and human liberation. And he has to make this sacrifice, but it breaks him, and this is. I think the ultimate thing actually that has him walking alone into the desert. Whereas for Leto, who is successful and does manage to, within this sort of narrative we'd have, pursue these wisdoms and remain sort of bound to the cause of human freedom ultimately, and of liberation, let's say, he's sacrificed his humanity sort of in every way to do so. And I don't really have a clear picture in my head of exactly what I think that means, but Leto, it's written in the books that he cries once in his life, for example, once he's become this horrendous worm, and that even that looks grotesque, and he's only been able to briefly afford himself one sort of love, and even that is a political game. He's ultimately one of the more tragic figures images or persons I'm aware of in fiction for how much he's being asked to sacrifice and is acutely aware of in pursuit of what might be right. And what you have there is to sort of finally answer the question, I guess it would be there seems to be this tension where the retention of the ego uh, comes hand in hand with the preservation of a lot of your human attachments or your humanity, whereas a robust rejection of any swelling of the ego almost comes in conflict with your humanity or at the expense thereof. But I bet Mark has some illuminating thoughts on this as well.
I really like that comparison between Paul and Leto. And Leto, yeah, does actually sacrifice his humanity. His genetics unravel and he becomes this kind of like this god being, this worm. I guess like it all, like the central irony for me is that there's this kind of like dual hope that the people have for a green planet and for a Messiah. And I just I can't get over this irony, right? That in order to live in a nice planet without any still suits, to just lie down on the grass and be able to jump in the water, and have a nice green planet like that, and not live in this constant state of stress, physical stress, you have to relinquish the spice. Or you have the spice, which allows you to imagine a better world in the context of this incredibly ecologically oppressive environment. And both of those myths, by the way, you know, there's often talk in like among like Dune literary theorists that the Fremen are like the indigenous people, and then there's the evil Imperium who have come. But actually, you know, this is millions of years of human history have gone by, and the Fremen religion itself has been inculcated with these hopes, these lusts, these drives. Their myths themselves are. It's not just that the affordance to create a green planet through planetology science comes from the outside world. It's also that the myth itself comes and is being so it's not just the ecology, but the theology is also being terraformed by the Bene Gesserit, and yet it still backfires, and yet there's still this tension, you know. So I mean, yeah, it just comes down to, if you have a good life, do you need, if you have a good life, or if you formed a good society, do you need the psychedelics anymore? It's like it comes back to that thing that Bruce Parry said, you know, maybe they're stepping stone.
Yeah, amazing. Certainly. And I mean, I'm not sure if that's covered in the book itself, but it didn't really come clear from the movies whether the Fremen themselves also have this same kind of addiction to spice as the rest of them, or you know, because obviously they are so immersed with the substance in itself that it's like affected their evolutionary history. So it's like the question is like, how would they even exist without it if it wasn't around in such vast quantities, I suppose.
There is that's true. They have co-evolved with this drug for thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years. That's true, and their eyes are different color because of it. But there is a telling point, I think, on page 300, where Paul's going through the memories of the Fremen people, and they've used other drugs on different planets. There is, I think they refer to one of them as a poison, whatever, but spice is also referred to as a poison. I mean, spice is everywhere on Dune. It's in the air they breathe. It's in the food they eat. It's in it's in that sense, you know, the strict analogy with the psychedelic does kind of fall down, because it's kind of, yeah, it's intrinsically part of their environment.
It cannot be DMT then.
Well, but then again, you know, DMT is endogenous, right? We produce it ourselves, for potentially neuroplasticity, for the purpose of changing our models about the world, and for the purpose of, in this case, I guess, you know, they're socioplastogens, changing the social structures. But yeah, it's, yeah. What was your question? Forgive me. I've been.
I didn't pose a new question. It was more about just a comment about whether the Fremen are also equally addicted to it as the rest of the.
Oh, addicted. Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, in that sense, again, it's not like a traditional psychedelic, because it is highly addictive and you can't live without it. Yeah.
It does kind of come back to that. It's probably worth admitting to, or being fair to the fact that there are ways that conservatism comes in ways that people have been fairly critical of. He calls this indigenous uprising a jihad. We can see a clear thing there. And it's overtly genocidal in its end. There's very much, one can see a critique of decolonization in Dune, which I don't think is necessarily there. I think that what Herbert is more observing, and I think as it relates to the question, is the pervasivity of human power relations and ideology means that in this case, or in the sort of fugal interplays, this decolonial war for liberation, even that can be like subverted or corrupted or made in what one way we might want to call bad. Similar with the engagement with the spice. This is a substance which in most books would just be seen as unproblematically transcendental, but in this context is instead sort of abusable and usable, for human ordained power relations at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's it goes so deep. And also, Mark has just texted me saying, sorry for my buttering jihad laptop crashed back soon. So that is Mark, and he will return in a moment. There's another question that I was curious about, which was around, actually, maybe I can wait with my question. I just saw that there was a question from Paul, so maybe we can give that one a shot. Oh, Mark, you have returned.
I'm so sorry for my Butlerian jihad there.
It's okay. It's okay. We have another question. You didn't miss anything besides Joseph's very beautiful response to the previous question. But now you're muted. You're still muted.
But it was so beautiful, and yeah, I'll look at it on YouTube, I guess. Thank God there's no Butlerian jihad, but I'm sorry for mine.
Okay, so there's a question from Paul. Isn't the jihad just exchanging economic colonialization for religious colonialization?
In many, I mean, my initial thing, Mark, I think in terms of how it interplays with spirituality, I wonder Mark might have some very interesting insights. But as an initial thrust, yeah, like that's the sort of, I think, the ironic thrust that Herbert, or in many ways subversion's probably the best word I'd use for a lot of what Herbert's trying to do. We subvert what looks like a noble decolonial effort by observing the sort of religious colonization that comes at the end of it, which becomes an inevitability because of the sort of ways Paul has chosen to pursue liberation. Again, I'd say all to this point that it's the sort of frailty and corruptibility of human endeavor that we need to just be a conscious critic of. Because he'd absolutely agree with your point there, yeah.
Mark, do you want to answer this question as well?
Can you restate the question slightly? Sorry.
Um,
I think it's just basically doesn't the jihad just replace what was once an economic and extractionist colonial empire with a religious colonial empire?
Yeah, that is what the jihad does. Yeah, it's a theocracy, right? It's the terrible purpose that he senses right at the beginning of the book, that he's trying to avoid, but that inevitably comes to pass. And yes, so that he is a kind of failed hero, anti-hero. It's that kind of dawning awareness, like almost like, you know, if you're feeling paranoid and you're coming out of a NOS trip, that terrible purpose. Oh, what's my purpose? You know.
So sorry about that, everyone. We don't know what happened. I did not press anything in the machine.
I think it must be.
Somebody is trying to sabotage this webinar.
It happened just when I was referring to the sensation that people report feeling coming out of a nitrous oxide experience of terrible purpose, which machines can't themselves share. So the machines are jealous.
Okay, so there's another question that I wanted to go into, which is that why do you think Paul is just 15 years old? Like, why does the messianic figure in Dune need to be this young boy who is just embarking on his even adulthood? And in a sense, he's not quite, he's not mature to really have a full account of his own role, and there's obviously lots of naive innocence and idealism. So have you considered why Paul is so young, only 15, when all of this starts?
I like the identification of naivety almost, or like idealism. Like it's true of both Leto and Paul. If we identify the two of them as both going through a sort of hero's journey, there is sort of a zeal they both have at the beginning of the text, which is like mediated and controlled and ultimately in some way scaled back, either with Paul by sort of regret and self-recrimination, and with Leto by what he just call wisdom, I suppose, or like spice-born knowledge, I think he keeps saying. But I think my main thing would be my main feeling is that it just relates to the hero's journey. I think these are very typically young male characters who are set through this cycle of, you know, waking up to a cause, genesis, becoming, and the sort of achievement of their goal often coincides with like the achievements of some form of maturity as well. I think it would relate primarily to just that as a literary device, probably.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are two ways of looking at it, right? Either within the world itself, that he has to step up to his ducal duty, or his siege duties as a the life in a feudal world. Your adolescence doesn't continue luxuriantly into your 20s in that kind of world, but there's also that, yeah, on the level of why has Herbert chosen to cast this as a 15-year-old. And I think it is important for teenagers to read this book. I mean, it really explores. It's a primer in socio-political anthropology, ecology. And it keeps you emotionally engaged as well, in the characters. So I think, yeah, there's a desire to appeal there to a teenage audience for sure. There's even a love story, you know.
Yeah, that's a good point. That is a very good point.
There's vim, there's energy. Is there wisdom? Well, apparently you can inherit the wisdom of your ancestors through this substance, but yeah, that's kind of a plot device, I guess. But yeah, I think that all comes into it really.
Okay, well, thank you for the great answer to that question and to all the other ones. Really appreciating this conversation. So many great insights about Dune and how it relates to the psychedelic experience, how it relates to the contemporary ongoing psychedelic renaissance. And I think there's so much more to decipher here. Well, there's one more question in the chat, and then we're gonna do that question in conjunction with your closing remarks. So Paul's question is, do you think it's important to have a certain amount of lived experience, such as maturity, before exploring or mind expansion through psychedelics? So we'll have that question and then your closing remarks all at once. Who would like to go first?
I will go first then. No, thank you everyone. Again, sorry for running because I think like the discussion and dialogue here has been fascinating. If only there was more. In terms of maybe doing the question first, because I think I can tie it into closing remarks. Lived experience might be one thing, but I think maturity is really what I would sort of agree with that. I think amount of lived experience can occasion a level of maturity, but it's not, I wouldn't say maturity in the way of, just age, but more like wisdom and some level of self-mastery or self-knowledge. I would repeat nothing more interesting than the typical trope that sort of set and setting are essential. Your ability to sort of engage in a controlled and mediated or like intentional way with this, before trying to incur anything like mind expansion would be best, and to sort of know what it is you're seeking and have the ability to seek. And I think that would tie readily into my closing remarks, which would be that that level of intentionality should be carried through in all our engagements, be they like in any political sphere, including how they relate to the psychedelic renaissance, and that we should always be this sort of conscious and considered, critical individuals that Herbert wants us to be, but also fascinated by openness. He remarks at one stage that as we expand our knowledge, we expand our awareness of what we don't know, and sees that as an exciting journey, which I hope you would agree with me would be a very correct statement he's making there.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Joseph. That's beautiful. Yeah, I'd like to conclude with the words of William James, who said, the community stagnates without the impulse of the individual, but the impulse dies without the sympathy of the community. And I think, yeah, what Dune alerts us to is, if you are indeed interested in engaging in visionary experiences, it's very, very it's very good to be aware of the ways in which language, culture, your whole being is a gift from the past, and that moment, that moment between the impulse and the response, that moment of choice is yours for sure. But yeah, within I just come always back at the moment to those timeless words of Heschel, that within our awe we only know that all we own we owe.
So great. Such a great line to end with, truly. Okay, well, this has been a great pleasure. Thanks everyone who came back after the break and stuck till the end. And the recording will be posted on YouTube. I will just redrop
both halves of it.
No, the whole thing. maybe with some minor edits. And there's again the link if you're able to donate to Mark and Joseph for their time. That would be great. And much appreciating you all. Much love, and take care of yourself and have a good night. Sleep well.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you,
Okay.
Johanna.
Toodaloo.
Really loved
Bye.
this discussion. Thank you.
Likewise. Okay. Goodbye.